Maybe, for some of us, this past week didn't go how we had hoped. Something didn't work out, something didn't get resolved, something's still hanging in the air, uncertain. And if we're honest, it's not just this past week. Sometimes that happens often. At some point, all of us have said these words, maybe not out loud, but in our hearts. We had hoped. We'd hoped things would finally turn around. We'd hoped that our child would find their way back. We had hoped to grow old together. That's where the disciples are in today's gospel. They are lost in their disappointment. They're walking away from Jerusalem, and they say, "But we were hoping he would be the one to redeem Israel." Their hope wasn't wrong. They just couldn't see yet the whole story. From their perspective, everything was lost on Good Friday. But from God's perspective, Good Friday was the road to their redemption and hope. And that's the tension we all live in, the limits of our vision compared to the fullness of God's. And that's the heart of the message series we are now in, because the way we see shapes the way we live. And today's gospel gives us two questions worth carrying with us each day. But the disciples weren't ready to answer those questions yet. As they're walking along, Jesus comes alongside them, but they don't recognize him. They're focused on their disappointment. And maybe that happens to us more than we realize. We're walking through something difficult, something confusing, something unresolved, and we might assume that God is nowhere to be found, when in reality, he is right beside us. But we don't recognize him because we're seeing from our perspective. And that brings us to the first question. How have you experienced God? Today, this week, in the middle of whatever you're carrying right now. We can't answer that question if we're not attentive to his presence in our lives. And how does Jesus make the disciples more aware? He breaks open the scripture, helping the disciples to see God's deeper works. And we see that pattern in the Bible. Abraham saw an impossible promise. God saw the father of nations. Joseph's brothers meant it for harm. God used it for the good of many. And we've all seen something like that closer to home. A parent watches their child struggle and doesn't step in right away. Not because they don't care, but they can see something the child cannot. The same reality, but a different perspective. This is exactly what Jesus is doing on the road. He's teaching them to see from God's perspective and how the scriptures had been leading to him. And later, what do they say? They say, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he opened the scriptures to us?" And that's our challenge as well. We need help. We need to be shown who he is, what he desires for us, what we cannot see on our own. We need the church, and we need each other. And scripture is where we begin, for that is where God reveals himself to us. Here at Mass, God is truly present in the liturgy of the Word. It is he himself who speaks when sacred scripture is proclaimed. And once we come to know him through his Word, something in us awakens. The same situations are still there, but we notice them differently. A line from scripture stays with us all day. An unexpected kindness reminds us we're not alone. We find patience where we once had none. We now see circumstances in a new light. And then the disciples' eyes are opened. Not on the road, not in a conversation, but at the table. Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them. And in that moment, they recognize him, and the whole road suddenly makes sense. But it doesn't stop there. In the Eucharist, we don't just learn to recognize God, we receive his very presence. We receive grace that changes our heart and strengthens our will. Power to love when it is difficult, to forgive when it is impossible, to choose what is good, even when it costs us, even when our hopes have been disappointed. Because we don't just need to see a new way, we need to be transformed so that what began to stir in us can take root and shape the way we live. And what happens next? The disciples don't stay in the village. They get up at once and they go back to Jerusalem, back to the others. Because when you truly encounter Christ, you can't keep it to yourself. Someone once said, evangelization is one beggar telling another where to find bread. That's it. It doesn't have to be a program. It doesn't have to be pressure. Evangelization is just one person who has found something precious and can't imagine not sharing it. You just have to run and tell someone. And that leads to our second question. How have you been an intentional disciple? Not because you have all the answers, but because you have encountered him. An encounter with Christ always leads somewhere. It always moves outward, to act, to reach out, to live differently, because we see differently. And so that Emmaus journey is now ours. We all walk the road every day with hopes, with questions, with disappointments. We had hoped. And along that road, Jesus comes to meet us too. In his word, in his sacraments, in his church, and in each other. He was on the road with them, and he is on the road with you, right now, today. So that what once felt confusing now begins to make sense. What feels like loss is not the end of the story. What feels impossible is not beyond his grace. We can experience peace and purpose, not because everything is resolved, but because he gives us new sight and strength. So this week, stay with those two questions. How have you experienced God? Where are you noticing him? And how have you been an intentional disciple? Are you sharing the gift that you have received? Because the way we see shapes the way we live. And when we begin to see from God's perspective, we find ourselves back on the road, walking back towards hope, with Christ at the center of the story that we live and share.